carbon emissions being on 25% and you've got 49% by 2030,
Yeah.
have you got a plan of how you can achieve that 49% by 2030? What kind of actions do you need to be achieving? Have you got milestones along the way?
I'll hand over to Tim for that one.
Yes, we do. I think a large part of the decarbonisation of surface access, and it's important to note that on-the-ground emissions account for 5% of Heathrow's overall carbon emissions. Surface access is 80% of that, so there's a big opportunity to go out here. And we plan to do that through supporting the transition to electric vehicles, which is going to play a really significant part in overall decarbonisation of travel to and from the airport. And we have plans to deliver EV charging facilities for all of our landside user groups at the airport that are customers of ours in surface access, whether that's supporting TfL with their EV bus transition that will decarbonise not just travel around London, but specifically at the airport, but also our private hire and taxi facilities and providing charging for passengers and colleagues. But obviously our plans around public transport mode share are going to play a big part in that too. And obviously our overall ambition is to take more vehicles off the roads and have more people coming to the airport on public transport, as well as active travel for colleagues, which can play a big part to take even more cars off the road and provide more sustainable commutes.
Yes, I think back in 2016 December, I was talking with Chris Joyce, who was then head of surface transport at Heathrow, and he said on cycling, in terms of our submission to the Airports Commission, we set out a plan that meant we could grow the airport without putting more traffic on the roads. We are absolutely committed to supporting the approach of not putting more cars on the road so we can tackle things like traffic congestion and air quality. So is that still the case, that you're trying to do all of this without getting more cars on the road?
Yeah, that's still the ambition, and everything we're doing within surface access is striving towards that. So, I mean, you phrased the question in terms of active travel, but obviously active travel is a really key part to help us achieve that. And I can go into more detail on our plans around active travel if you want, or if there's a question later.
Well, if you could just briefly sort of say how you're doing in terms of, since 2016, where clearly increasing active travel to the airport was a priority, how much progress you've made since then in terms of improving the routes and options for people to cycle rather than driving.
Yeah, so a lot of the plans that Chris talked about in 2016 would have been linked to what was then being developed through the expansion proposals, and obviously when that all stopped in early 2020, that meant a lot of the work that was proposed didn't then progress as we'd have liked it to. So what we've done since COVID and since sort of the airport's recovery is we've worked with local authorities on a local cycling, walking and infrastructure plan, so an LC WIP, which is unique, or sort of first of its kind for an airport. So obviously we sit across we have our own infrastructure, but then we sit across 5 different local authorities. So that's about building a hub and spoke model we provide the infrastructure around the airport, and then the work with local authorities to build in the spokes, if you like. So we've begun a multi-million-pound infrastructure programme to build the active travel loop around the airport, including into the central terminal area, which we can't do till our current tunnel redevelopment project completes, but we have ambitions to provide an active travel loop all the way around, and the work to deliver that, or the business case and development of those projects is well underway. So we hope in the next few years to complete that.
Thank you. Anthony, do you have anything you want to say on all of this?
Yes, please. Yes, thank you, Chair. I think it's that the Transport Forum keeps a very beady eye on the statistics. That's what my background is and what I'm interested in. And we keep a close eye on the progress out towards the public transport targets, and also the customer satisfaction surveys with the various modes of access which Heathrow carry out, and which are also validated by some work that the Civil Aviation Authority do. So we keep a very beady eye on that. It's great that Heathrow is exceeding its target of 45% in terms of public transport access. I think we now need to see that that's sustainable and resilient over time. I don't think it's quite time to sort of ratchet it up straight away. I think I want to make sure it beds in and it works. But there is a question about what next. And clearly that target, we want to see it heading in the right direction. And then at some point, there's got to be a fresh target that's set, that really sets a scale of ambition, which changes the debate about access to Heathrow and about public transport access. And it's interesting looking at the satisfaction figures for the various modes of transport, because they're generally pretty high, actually. Unfortunately, the highest satisfaction is given to Kiss and Fly, that unfortunately named activity. But across the board, Heathrow Express, Elizabeth Line, there's pretty good levels of satisfaction, so we're keeping an eye on that. And in addition, what we're trying to do is also starting to get a much deeper dive into some of the accessibility questions. I don't think enough attention has been given to that in the future. The committee will be very aware of the increasing debates about accessibility in flying, and of course getting to the airport is a very key part of that. And we're just trying to understand a bit more about the statistics of how disabled passengers get to the airport, what their experience is. It's probably quite a bit of car parking, but we need to find out a bit more about that. The Elizabeth Line's helps on that because it is so accessible, but I think that's something that's very worth focusing on for the future. I'm glad you asked about active travel. That's something we keep a keen interest in. We have a very active member, Christian Woolmar from London Cycling Campaign, who is vociferous about the Northern Tunnel access. And you'll be aware that the way Heathrow has grown over the years has been slightly kind of patchwork, and therefore it's not ideal in terms of road access, let alone anything else. The Northern Tunnels, there is a plan to get cycling back through there again, which would be great. And there have been some good developments in terms of cycle parking at various terminals. Last year we went on a cycle tour around the perimeter of the airport, which was an extremely interesting experience because the provision varies from off-road, high-quality, dedicated cycle lanes, excellent, to cycling on the verge, which is a bit scary. And it can be quite a hostile environment around the airport for pedestrians and for cyclists. And so I think anything that can be done in that respect will give people more choice, especially staff, because people, when the weather's better, they probably do want to have a choice of cycling. So I think any initiative in that direction is good. One of the things that's interesting about that is the patchwork of local authority involvement. You know, sometimes you get a local authority has money, something appears, but then it runs out when it hits the boundary of the next local authority. And I hope something that the committee can focus on is increased working between the local authorities and increased working with TfL to try and improve the whole picture around the airport, because it is a complicated picture. It's something we try and put forward, we discuss quite a lot about. But I think any weight you could give to that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful points. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. My questions are on the Elizabeth line, so for Sophie and Tim. The report that was done by Civil Aviation Authority in 2014 calculated that the Elizabeth line would deliver no net benefit in terms of additional passengers at Heathrow, and as a result, Heathrow's contribution to the Elizabeth line would be reduced from an original estimate of 230 million to 70 million. Now, do you agree with this calculation?
I'm not sure it's appropriate for me to comment on the CAA's calculation.
So what in terms of the opening of Elizabeth line, what impact have you seen in terms of public transport?
So in terms of public transport, we've seen increased mode share on heavy rail and London. If you combine the rail modes, London Underground, Elizabeth Line, Heathrow Express, overall we've seen increased mode share by 2 or 3%. So it has brought more people onto public transport. But we have also seen a little bit of movement between the modes as well, because Elizabeth Line is obviously attractive to some people to use.
So can you give me any indication of financial support that you're expecting to provide for surface access improvements?
So in terms of ongoing BAU improvements, we spent 9 million in 2024, and we expect to continue to spend that sort of amount of money on bus and coach. What we will need to do when we're working through our plans for expanding Heathrow is work through the modelling that we need to do to understand the impact that expansion will have, and then we will be able to define the investment that we need and what projects we'll need to do to meet the public transport targets that we will need to meet.
In terms of investment, are you looking into investing in a way that will support people who want to travel to catch a plane that usually is there's a lot of flights that are leaving quite early from Heathrow, but getting a public transport option at those times is really challenging, and you're more likely to see people getting into a cab or driving to the airport. Have you looked into investment in that particular area?
So a lot of the money that we spend currently on bus and coach is in order to encourage operators to operate in those early and late hours. It's particularly to help colleagues get to work for shifts, but it does help obviously passengers who are on bus routes, etc., to be able to access the airport at those early and late times for flights. Regarding rail, there are constraints on rail around being able to operate early and late.
What discussions have you had with TfL and perhaps the Elizabeth line?
So we discuss with Network Rail and Elizabeth line around operating earlier and later, but there are constraints around the rail network and maintenance that needs to happen overnight that mean that you couldn't necessarily consistently run an earlier service. So we have just implemented 2 earlier Heathrow Express services. So they used to run to the airport empty and start from the airport, and we've just changed them so that they are passenger services from Paddington. And that I'd have to remind myself of the time, but it's you know, 4 or 5 in the morning. So the ambition
and the aim is to improve public transport for those early hours.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, I can add a couple of points on this. So we, as Sophie outlined, a big focus of that investment that we make in improving bus and coach is not just about new areas, it's about putting services on at earlier and later times to suit shift patterns, but also the flight patterns of the airport. And since between 23 and 24, we had a 33% increase in the number of bus services serving the airport before 4 a.m. and a 43% increase in buses serving the airport after 11 p.m. And in particular, we have Piccadilly line overnight services that run at the weekends, and during the week we solely fund a bus and a coach route that runs early morning, one along the Piccadilly line route, and we charge £1 to Team Heathrow colleagues and only slightly more for passengers, and the same along the Elizabeth line route. And they run all night through the week specifically to allow alternatives to people travelling from London who can't use rail before it starts running.
Is there any intention from Heathrow's perspective that if you are going to invest and increase opportunities for these earlier flights, that will mean an increase in flights itself, even at night time?
So I don't think the two are directly linked, and we've got restrictions on the times that we can fly. So although that's slightly outside our remit, we provide public transport options to people, so that, particularly to staff, so they can get here for the times of flights and the shift patterns they have to work. But I don't think that's directly linked to any plans to change the restrictions that are in place. So
any plans that you have in terms of improving public transport, particularly these times, will not correlate to increased flights in those times as well?
Yeah, that's correct. We provide services all through public transport options all through the night, because those are the times that people have to come to work and work through the night, and passengers have to be at the airport for 4 in the morning for a 6 o'clock flight. It's not linked to any plans to change the times of flights.
Anthony.
Thank you. I think it's a very good question, because, of course, the context of all this is that flying is booming at the moment, and the number of passengers using Heathrow is at the highest levels ever, I think, in some respects. So it's a very real question. I think the issue about timing is a very important one, because lots of aspects of the airport are 24-hour operations, you know, the cargo and all the ancillary activities, and therefore matching the transport to the 24-hour nature of it is going to become increasingly important. And I think your point's well made about taxis, because of course people often will think, I'm making an occasional journey, I'm not sure about the time, I've got some luggage, I'll shell out on a taxi, you know, if it's 50 quid or whatever, it's once a year. And I think getting the cost and convenience kind of issues right for passengers is going to be absolutely crucial. And a lot of what's available, I think, and Heathrow is aware of this, it's publicising it is quite a challenge, because there's quite a number of providers of these services, and getting the right information to the right people at the right time can be quite challenging. But I think the airport's aware of this, and more needs to be done to get people aware of what the options are, because sometimes there are options when people just don't think there are. So it is quite positive. So just getting that information to people in a way that's usable and useful, and getting the price right, is absolutely crucial. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to, before I hand over to Assemblymember Foos, I just want to follow up on Assemblymember Bakari's question. So, Sophie, you said you didn't want to comment on the CAA's calculations, but can you comment on the previous assertion that the Elizabeth line has delivered no net additional passengers to Heathrow? Because surely that is something in terms of monitoring passengers and how they get there, and that is something that you would have an assessment of.
So, as I said earlier, it's obviously increased the catchment of the airport into the east of London and beyond. I think we might have to come back with a written answer on whether there's been an increase overall in passengers as a result of the Elizabeth line.
I think we'd really like to know that, because obviously, and I appreciate, just to say that obviously we are big fans of buses and coaches here. They're really, really important, but they are cheap. And you have mentioned the 9 million spent on buses quite a lot, which is welcome. But then when we're looking at hundreds of millions to improve the Elizabeth line that may or may not have delivered improvements to your business, but that you didn't have to pay, I think that's really important, considering the context we're in terms of improvements that may be required in the future. So I think we would like to hear your answer specifically on that.
We'll come back to you on that.
Assemblymember Mahfouz.
Thank you. So I'm going to start off with some questions, I think carrying on really from some of the points that you're making there, both Sophie and Tim, around surface access for staff in particular. So the airport's national policy statement commits Heathrow to achieving a 25% reduction of all staff car trips, which we've heard from Anthony is obviously sort of reduced to just over 50% at the moment by 2030, and a reduction of 50% by 2040 from the 2013 baseline level. Can you tell us just first of all what progress has been made to reduce the number of staff car trips to and from Heathrow?
Thank you for the question. So the way that we currently measure colleague mode share to the airport isn't in total vehicle trips, because we don't currently have a way of measuring that reliably, because obviously there are so many vehicles on the road and determining which are airport related or not. But how we do measure that is in terms of the overall colleague single occupancy vehicle mode share, and as Sophie outlined earlier, we did that last year through the largest survey we've ever done of all of the employees across all of Heathrow, so Team Heathrow as we call it, which is all the supply chain partners. That's over 80,000 employees, and we surveyed 11,000 of them. And we've seen a 10% drop since the last time we did that survey before COVID, which we think demonstrates really strong progress towards achieving that. But we don't think we've yet delivered the maximum benefit that we could, and we've worked really hard to improve the quality of services, both in terms of destinations and serving the destinations that we know have the highest density of Team Heathrow colleagues. But also, as we've touched quite a lot on already, the matching that to shift patterns and providing discounts and making those services as affordable as possible for repeat commutes. And as Anthony touched on, it's about making people aware of that. So we've spent a lot of money and effort putting the services on, but now to see the maximum benefit of that, we need to get more and more people on that. And we are seeing increased patronage. So between 23 and 24, we had an over 100% increase in patronage on services that we fund, bus services that we fund to the airport. And seen not quite 100% this year, but again, a really, really positive continued patronage on those services again this year. But we think there's more to do. It's making people aware, and we've got programs in place that make colleagues aware of the services that are available to them. But we've got some really sort of dark hidden corners of Team Heathrow for some very small companies, and getting the word out to them is the biggest challenge I think we have from a colleague perspective, to make them aware of what's already available to them.
Thanks, Tim. So you said over 100% increase. It'd be really good to see some figures, if you haven't necessarily got those with you today, as to what that actually looks like in overall numbers, because I'll come to which services are currently funded, but they're relatively limited in terms of the service options that people have got for the middle of the night. So we had some feedback from G&B, who obviously represent a considerable number of Team Heathrow workers there, and they've identified in their representations issues like the lack of park and ride, shuttle buses, limited options for late and early shifts. I had a young lad who's a constituent of mine who just got his first job at Heathrow. Fantastic. He was working, obviously, entry-level job, low pay, middle of the night arrival, and his option was to get, well, I think one of the shuttle buses that you were talking about from West Ealing. But in order to get there in the first place at that time of night, really the only option for him was to pay for an Uber to get to that sort of starting point. How can we make sure that particularly low-paid staff like that, know the options are available, and making sure that they're actually, they are as cheap as possible, because they are making sure that Heathrow is running on a day-to-day basis, and without them, we can't have Heathrow working.
Yeah, I think it's a really well-made point, and one we agree with, that we've referenced shift patterns as a challenge, and travelling overnight on public transport for many people isn't the most attractive option, but our job is to try and make that affordable, and also improve awareness of it, and obviously want that to feel as safe as possible for people doing that journey. But the affordability is something that we do challenge, and those services we put on overnight, we subsidise them heavily to make them affordable. And you touched on park and ride as well, and we've currently, as obviously this is in our strategy to do more of this, but we do currently have 2 park and ride sites out to the west. One's recently moved to Winnersh Triangle in Reading, and another in High Wycombe, where there's free parking for Team Heathrow colleagues, and then they can pay a subsidised rate for on the existing bus or their sort of longer distance bus services that run from those sites into the airport every 20 minutes, and it's a big part of what we're trying to do.
Can I just add a couple of points?
Of course, Sophie, yeah.
So how we have designed which bus routes that we'll subsidise and so on is by mapping where the colleagues are against what the existing bus services are. So in 2023, when the ULEZ was introduced, we were aware that that was a risk for colleagues. So we mapped where the density of colleagues was and where the gaps were, and that's where we focused our efforts to improve bus services. So that's kind of the method, I suppose, to try and make sure that we address those concerns. And then just on the comms point, so to Team Heathrow, so over 80,000 people that we need to try and reach. We have a comms campaign called Way to Go, which is digital, is face-to-face. We do road shows all over the airport to try and almost do sort of one-to-one conversations with someone who knows all about public transport, so that colleagues can really kind of discuss their individual concerns and their route and get some advice.
That's really helpful. You mentioned 80,000 staff working across Team Heathrow. So how many actually took part in the survey that you'd referred to there, Tim?
There were 11,000, which is the highest we've achieved. That's a very, as these surveys go, we considered that to be a very representative sample, and we worked hard to ensure that wasn't just from people that work for Heathrow Airport or British Airways, the 2 largest employers, but we deliberately kept the survey open longer than planned to ensure we got representative samples by going out to speak to individuals one-to-one from the full range of companies and different demographics we needed to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic response rate. So in terms of with the 50-odd% who were still travelling by vehicle, have you had a chance to go back to them to understand what the rationale behind that and their level of knowledge, given all the marketing that you've done around the alternatives?
So included in that survey was very detailed. It was only about travel. So we had the opportunity to ask a lot of questions, and that included what's behind people's decisions about how they do what they, or how they've decided what their mode of transport to work. So that's given us a lot of information which we're still working through to then determine what the action plan is to encourage more people to transfer into more sustainable travel. One area where I think we have an opportunity is on car share, which we've got a car share scheme. I think we could do more to make that attractive and to make it more understood and recognised by colleagues across the airport.
So, I mean, Tim, in part, so I will come back to you, Anthony. In part of your answer, you gave 2 park and ride options, both very much to the west of London, and I appreciate, obviously, to the east of Heathrow, we've got some fantastic public transport options. But going back to the cost, what we do have is the Heathrow Spur, and as soon as the trains go onto the Heathrow Spur, it increases the costs of that journey. So, of course, clearly Heathrow Express is a very expensive alternative for any staff really to be using that on a daily basis. But the Elizabeth line does obviously have that premium for using that route because it is going on the private Heathrow Spur where there is a charge from Heathrow Airport. How do you ensure that that doesn't impact on staff access?
So we worked hard with our colleagues at TfL to negotiate a discount for Heathrow Airport. Well, to negotiate a discount, we reimburse TfL for that discount, but there's a 50% discount for Heathrow Airport Limited employees, so between the airport and Paddington. And we negotiated that with the intention that other companies across the airport would take that offer up, which that didn't happen. So at the moment the discount is just for Heathrow Airport Limited. But we also offer free travel for Heathrow Airport on the Heathrow Express and 75% off for all of Team Heathrow.
Okay. And you talked about cycle routes. So at the moment, I mean, I used to, when I worked in Staines, I'd cycle past on the perimeter road. Probably fine for me as a sort of more confident cyclist, but clearly quite hairy for anybody really sort of using those journey, travelling to and from, particularly sort of T4 and T5, I think, where it's just a bit more difficult to get to. What work are you doing in terms of making it easier for staff? Because obviously, if you're travelling from Heathrow, you're probably much less likely to be cycling to the destination. But in terms of for staff, particularly at those awkward times, it could be a really good alternative.
Yeah, I'll come in on that. I'm sure Anthony will then have some thoughts on active travel too, because it's a topic that we focus a lot on with the Area Transport Forum, as Anthony referenced earlier. So, I referenced earlier the LC WIP, the Local Cycling Walking Infrastructure Plan that we've developed. That set out the prioritised list of interventions we need to do, and it was developed collaboratively with the local authorities, so with Spelthorne, with Slough, with Hillingdon, with Ealing, with Hounslow, all the authorities, and Windsor and Maidenhead, so all the ones that surround us. And that we all agreed that these are the priority routes to develop that hub and spoke model that we talked about. So it's not just safer to cycle around the perimeter, which is the bit that we can take care of, but also that we can work with the local authorities to refer back to this document which set out what are the priority routes that are going to make the biggest difference to colleagues. And that route you referenced up from Staines is at the top of that list. There's a very tricky, treacherous roundabout currently that we need to make safer, and the challenge being it's across 4 different each different bit of that roundabout is across 4 different authorities. So it's going to require some joined up working that we're trying to initiate to facilitate that, but it's definitely on our to-do list.
I think a very good line of questioning. Without data, we're going nowhere, and the colleague travel survey that the airport's carried out is absolutely crucial. We press them to do this. We press them to make it as big as possible, and the response rate, as you've acknowledged, is very good, actually. It's interesting to try and understand the context of the airport, I think, in this respect. It's taken me a bit of time to do this because it's a huge employer, 80,000, 90,000 people, and it's not everybody works for Heathrow. There are a lot of actors involved, and there are also people who've got businesses in close proximity to the airport. So Heathrow doesn't necessarily have all the levers it can pull. And if you've been maintaining a plane in the middle of the night in a shed, or you've come off a flight from the Middle East or something, a car is probably quite an attractive option in the middle of winter. And getting passengers to change their behaviour in terms of cost and convenience is one thing, but getting colleagues to is quite another thing. And the airport is quite rightfully focusing on this. And I think the emphasis on car parking is very, very important because there are carrots and sticks here. We see the sticks in terms of the terminal drop-off charge, trying to get passengers to think about how they're travelling to the airport. And of course, charges for car parking are very important as well. And I think the airport is going through a big process of reviewing its whole car parking estate. And the provision of that and the charges for that be in terms of the relative attractiveness. So I think that's very, very important. The active travel, yes, and that roundabout is kind of a real case study. It's really hopeless because you end up in a bush on your bike, which is not a very attractive option. But the airport is building a link around the south side to improve one of the gaps in the cycling round, and the local authorities have been very responsive to the kind of joined-up response, which is also something we're trying to replicate with buses, because the bus provision in and around the airport is mighty complex, and every time I go there I still see a bus and I think, where's that going? Where's that come from? Who's paying for that? It's a very complex picture, but I think we're making progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I wanted to come back to you, actually, just in terms of, to ask you rather than Tim and Sophie, although I'm sure they'll have their comments, is going back to the free travel. There is a free travel zone around the airport, but it is literally around the airport. So in terms of getting on a bus, you might be able to get on one or two bus stops, so to one of the local hotels on the Bath Road, for example. And that, I understand, is obviously funded from Heathrow, but is that the best way of spending that funding in terms of encouraging people to actually, you know, and particularly thinking about staff, because most of that is, you know, from what I can imagine, is benefiting foreign travellers who are using the airport, and so they are getting a sort of free travel to and from their hotel. But actually the reality of that is that hotels will put on their own alternative shuttle buses and what have you. So is there a point in how it's currently funded, and could that funding be used better in your opinion?
I don't think I wouldn't like to say used better, because I think it's good. It does a job and it's giving people choices. I think what the scale of it and the size of the area is a discussion, and about the funding for other bus services. But anything you can do to sort of change the cost, convenience paradigm is going to help. Although, if something's free but there's no bus in the middle of the night, it's not very helpful. So it's got to be part of the focus. This is all part of a package, because as we've seen with bus travel post-COVID, you know, even concessionary pass users, you know, the numbers have gone down across the country, even though it's free. And so, you know, it's about the cost, convenience, and it's about the whole package of measures.
Oh yeah, so I'll just come back and exit. Things have changed somewhat since 2019, when every single bus service around the airport was free. So the free travel zone still exists, but in a slightly different way. Because, as you suggest, we didn't feel that reintroducing that to make every single bus free was the best use of limited, I mean, good amount of money, but limited money that we want to spend bringing people to the airport, not just ferrying people already here around it. So it is still possible to travel around the airport, and we've introduced free travel on the Piccadilly line to Hatton Cross, which is a really important employment location at the airport. And you can still get everywhere you need to get around the airport for free. It's just not every single bus anymore, because we've diverted that money towards everything else we've talked about, to provide services from everywhere else around the airport, to provide more options to get people to the airport in the first place.
So you've reviewed that already, and that's implemented some of those changes that you've talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Okay. And I presumably off the back of the survey, as detailed as it is, you could look to review it again? Yeah. I'm going to move on to the current challenges with parking. So again, you know, having spoken and been at meetings with residents of the Heathrow villages, just obviously north of Heathrow in Hillingdon Borough, there's a number of challenges that they've got with antisocial behaviour in terms of the people parking there, and that's from commuters. But I'm going to focus first of all just in terms of the minicab drivers and illegal activity that's been going on there. So one of the questions I asked recently in Mayor's Questions was around the amount of illegal activity of illegal drivers touting at Heathrow, which obviously, going back to the point we talked about before, is very much around safety in terms of the quality of the car, the driver, etc. What are Heathrow doing to make sure that you are clamping down on this? Because at the moment, the question I asked said that there is sporadic enforcement, but it isn't systematic.
Yeah, so the two parts of that question. So on the touting one, which I don't have such a detailed answer for, is there is enforcement. We work with the Met Police to and TfL to ensure that the appropriate enforcement stop touting is in place, and that's kept under review with our operational teams to make sure that that is adequate. But it's not part of my day-to-day remit, so I don't have much more of a comment than that. But what is much more of our remit within surface access is the antisocial behaviour, and we've done some, I think, really positive work through the Area Transport Forum that Anthony's kept a close watch over us on. Around, we've done what we think is quite innovative and first of its kind, is public space protection orders in the local areas around the airport, which are specifically targeted at private hire vehicles. As you referenced, it's a long-standing issue around antisocial behaviour that we've long wondered with the local authorities how to tackle. So we've had a special interest group through the Heathrow Air Transport Forum that's brought together local residents, community groups, TfL, Met Police, British Parking Association, and ourselves. And we, in May last year, Spelthorne brought forward PSPOs in Stanwell and Stanwell Moor, which are the two hotspots to the southwest of the airport. And since that came in, there's been over 1,500 interventions made, but only 4 repeat offenders, which I think suggests that the success of that scheme, that once these drivers are finding out about it, they're staying away. And a significant reduction in complaints that we're getting about antisocial behaviour and littering in particular. And it was successful enough that Hillingdon introduced one to tackle the impact of, or to mirror it, but also tackle any displacement. And that came into effect in January. And we as Heathrow are supporting with funding for additional enforcement in these areas to ensure that they have sort of long-standing success and aren't just sort of a flash in the pan. So.
Yeah, I mean, when I spoke to the leader of Hillingdon Council, and obviously, as you say there, it wasn't introduced at the same time as in Spelthorne, so there was an impact of displacement. It's been around since January, but the question is, in terms of, sort of level of enforcement, is it at the right level? Could it be more, and should it be more? What would be your initial assessment after 2.5 months of it being introduced?
We'd have to pick those conversations up with Hillingdon, but we've committed to a level of funding to support the enforcement of that. Obviously, local authorities have their part to play in it as well, but we speak regularly with the council and could to find out their views on whether it's been sufficient.
Yeah, thank you. The Transport Forum spent a lot of time in the last 15 months focusing on this issue quite properly. 2 parts to this, as you point out. The minicab provision to the airport, Bolt and Uber are geo-fenced, so to speak, into the authorised vehicle area, which is a facility in which they pay for, which it has a number of food, toilet options, etc. But of course, there's no requirement for other taxis to use that. So you do get an interesting spread of taxis all around the perimeter of the airport. And I think one local authority did a survey recently and found taxis from as far away as Cornwall and Scotland. And of course, taxi drivers doing those sort of occasional journeys are not necessarily even going to know about the authorised vehicle area. So getting the information to them is quite important. There's been a big push on that. But the other minicabs waiting in surrounding areas, it does cause antisocial behaviour because there are essentially very few facilities. And I've seen it, littering, antisocial behaviour, parking. And the other issue is rogue meet and greet providers who people hand over their cars to, which slightly amazes me, quite frankly, but they do. They hand over expensive cars to these people. And sometimes, these people are just parking them on the street, nose to tail. They're using them for goodness knows what in the interim. And then people go and pick up their cars and the keys under the arch. It just in the parking. It seems quite extraordinary that people do this. But anyway, what to do about it? We've spent a lot of time working with the local authorities, getting them to work with the airport on enforcement, and the public space protection order is having an impact. You're quite right. There can always be more enforcement, but it is having an impact. There will be a degree of displacement, but as each local authority surrounding the airport moves to enforce, it will gradually disrupt this activity. I don't think you'll ever get rid of it, and our aim has always been, well, we just want to disrupt this to the point that it becomes an occasional activity rather than something that local residents are having to endure on a daily basis. I think we're starting in that, we're moving towards that. We need to keep pushing on that. It's quite hard to get data in a sense, because when you see a minicab parked in a street, is it waiting for a fare, or is it somebody just a minicab driver who happens to live close by? There's a lack of data, so we're just trying to make sure that the level of noise and complaint there's never an acceptable level, but just that it becomes occasional. So it's a point well made. And on the road meet and greet parkers, the British Parking Association has now got in place a really good quality accreditation scheme. The airport has taken it on board. There's lots of information pushing consumers towards that. And of course, the thing to do is to get people to choose the right provider. And there's been a big campaign push through social media, Which Magazine, or Daily Mail, and all others, to get that information in front of people. And the sense is it is starting to have an effect, because the problem with enforcement in that area is it's so difficult. You know, you're chasing something that's moving the whole time, and illegal use of land, etc. It takes a long time, but there is progress.
Yeah, of course, Sophie.
On both those issues, we recognise that we can't just do something and then kind of it'll be fixed. We know that around the airport, you know, that is going to be an ongoing issue, and we will need to make sure that we sustain the funding, for example, to the local authorities for enforcement, and, you know, the ongoing communication to passengers about, so the new scheme is called AMGO, which is Approved Meet and Greet Operators. So we've been a founder member of that, and all our parking products have been approved. And, you know, we want to support other people that run not rogue parking operations around the airport to be part of that, so that our passengers can be safe and secure in the knowledge that they're using an appropriate operator.
It's really helpful. I mean, really good for you to be able to share the enforcement details, because obviously Anthony said about a lack of figures, but clearly one of those will be, you know, in terms of obviously less noise from residents feeling like they've been less impacted. And they'll visibly see that difference. But if you could share the enforcement information, that'd be really, really helpful. And then just finally, going back to the point that you kicked off on there, Anthony, again, Hillingdon Council obviously had to take one of the parking providers, these road providers, to court for a High Court injunction for illegal use of greenbelt land. We've seen an increase of that, where they're just using farmland and open spaces to park people's vehicles illegally. What more can be done to clamp down on that, so that the lengthy, costly process of having to take them for a High Court injunction isn't the only option available to them?
I think the key is getting people to choose the right provider in the first place, because if you deal with it upstream, you don't have the problem downstream. Constantly chasing people through the courts is really difficult. People change their company names, etc., etc. It has to be done, and it's quite proper that it's done, but it's slow. I think working upstream is the way to crack it.
So we do run a scheme for operators who want to use our multi-storey car parks to run a parking meet and greet operation. We do have kind of criteria that they need to meet to be able to have, for example, discounted use of the car parks to run their operation from. So we do have we implement our own standards, and if they fail to meet those, then that privilege, if you like, is withdrawn. But what we can't stop is, you know, people who just drive into the car park and use it. But yeah, so there's you need a combined approach of kind of what we can do in terms of controlling the operators that we interact with. But as Anthony said, the consumer information part of this is really important.
And sorry, just to be clear, is it, you know, so on the BEAA and you know, so that sort of the formal providers and those ones that are approved, is there a very clear message at the start that says, look, you know, in terms of beware of these cheaper alternatives that actually, goodness knows what they'll be doing with your car during the period of time?
So part of being part of that scheme is to be able to show that you're approved, and to give passengers information that they need to make sure that they choose, if not you, but an approved operator.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if we can do our bit to amplify that message, don't give your keys to somebody who's going to park it in a field at Heathrow Airport. I think that message comes from the London Assembly Transport Committee. Assembly Member Garron.
Thanks. Just thinking about people who drive to the airport, and obviously there's the drop-off business and the drop-off charge you've introduced, but I'm also thinking about people who drive and use the short-stay car parks. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Perhaps a question for you, Sophie, about whether you feel that that's about the right level, too high, too low, and what policies you might introduce in terms of changing the level of car parking that's available, or the pricing of the short-stay car parking, I mean.
So in terms of what we would like our passengers to do with regard to sustainable transport, dropping off and picking up is sort of the worst option because that's the most traffic on the road. So parking is better. We've got a surface access spectrum that shows, you know, from a sustainability point of view and traffic and communities, etc. We want to move people along that. So a drop-off or a pick-up involves a journey there and a journey back to drop them off, and a journey there and a journey back to pick them up again. Car parking is only one journey in, one journey out, for example. So it's a fine balance. We want to offer passengers choice, and we know that Kiss and Fly is absolutely the most popular way of arriving at the airport for obvious reasons, because you're in a controlled environment. So we've got
Quite
the
an unfortunate
levers.
phrase, that, isn't it?
Kiss and Fly.
Yes.
So,
Well,
so the pricing is a potential lever if we wanted to discourage that.
I suppose what I'm thinking is, so I represent Croydon and Sutton, so we've heard about all of these, from my point of view, mythical rail services that exist in other parts of London where people can whiz in and out on a Heathrow Express, possibly at great cost, or an Elizabeth line. People in Sutton in particular aren't really enjoying any of that. There's an SL7, but other than that, a lot of, in terms of the options for people to get there, obviously driving is more practical, simply because otherwise you're going to have to travel in and then across. And so there's obviously a sort of unfairness element there. If you are going to pursue very aggressively making it much harder for people to park, or say very prohibitively expensive to park in order to encourage people to travel by train, not only is it a longer journey, but obviously if you're with suitcases, making multiple changes, which you would have to do to get there from my part of London, is obviously much less convenient than hopping on an Elizabeth line and just going all the way there. So how do you think about that, you know, that contrast, and in particular making sure that those bits of London that aren't well served by direct rail links into West London aren't effectively shut out?
Yeah, so again, it's a well-made point, and we recognise that not every area of the country, let alone London, has a direct connection to the airport, and obviously we would love to do that. There is the SL7, so it does take a long time to get around London. But it's about trying to provide the best choice we can, and we do work hard to try and serve or provide, if not a direct connection, at least only an option with only one interchange, and we do work to try and model that. Obviously, a Southern Rail scheme in particular would be beneficial to South and South West London, and we do support that and the challenges around delivery of that in particular, but we have consensus around a scheme that would deliver direct connection through South London. But we need to provide a balance, and obviously we recognise that the drop-off charge shouldn't be prohibitively high, but we also have sustainability objectives we need to meet, and we try to put that at a price that adequately meets the balance of that. But a drop-off, as Sophie said, Kiss and Flies, it's known in the aviation industry, although we try not to use that term too often ourselves, it is the most convenient method of arriving at the airport, and that's why there's a cost associated.
I suppose the point, I mean, all that's well made, but obviously any of those new rails, particularly if it's a heavy rail scheme, that's at least a decade away from happening, if it happens at all. And so I suppose the point that I'm saying is that when you think about increasing those charges to create a deterrent effect, for some people it may be something that tips them over into switching, let's say, to the Piccadilly line or the Elizabeth line. For other people, it's simply just an additional charge because there really isn't a practical alternative. So I feel I've made that point. I just want to make sure that I had. Sorry, Anthony, did you want to come in on
Yes,
that?
please. Yes, I knew we'd get back to Feltham at some point in this hearing.
Shall I say, I used to, when I first started travelling into London, I travelled from Feltham, so it is
Yes.
airport.
Yes.
I'm very familiar. Sorry, a train station. I'm very familiar with.
I think there is, you're quite right, because there is a need for new rail schemes quite clearly from the west and the south, and there are quite well-developed schemes on the table, potentially subject to funding and planning, etc. But in the short term, bus and coach is going to provide quite a lot of the heavy lifting. But I think, you know, Feltham, you can access the airport quite easily, and of course there's connections at Clapham Junction, at Waterloo, and I think there's something to be done about improving the visibility of that as an option. It used to be a dedicated rail air link. You know, there's a plaque on the wall there which records that fact. It's not anymore. It's the bus services are part of the TfL network, but if you look at the tube and bus map, it doesn't give you any indication that Feltham might be a sensible way of getting to Heathrow. Last time I flew from Heathrow, intercontinental journey, I went on the G1 bus, followed, you know, all the way through on the 285 to get to another continent. It can work, but I think there's a need there for a real uplift in terms of publicity and in terms of making it visible to people as an option. And even when you get to the station, it's a little bit unclear in parts, which we're trying to do something about. But Croydon and Sutton, yes, it feels like a far-off place, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, you can perhaps gather I'm quite familiar with those journeys. So even so publicity to me wouldn't help, because I know that I have to get a train from my local station to Clapham, a horrible change at Clapham with heavy suitcases possibly, a train to Feltham, and then the bus from Feltham. That's, you know, the alternative is chuck my suitcases in the back of a taxi and then chill for 40 minutes. You can see. I feel I've made the point, but I think it's important to recognise that there's a practicality point in terms of the options that people have that I just wanted to bring up. The short other point I wanted to make about railway, there was about taxis. I saw in your surface plan there was a thing about trying to match inward and outward taxis to try and avoid this dead mileage problem. That sounded like a fascinating technical problem, so I'm interested in what that looks like. Tim, can you give us a hint?
It's not easy, as you say. So we are trying to work closely with private hire companies. We work with a company called Minicabit, who provide a dedicated, Minicabit, as it says on the tin. It matches it's an alternative, I guess, to the Uber and Bolt and the standard players in the market. I'm not too close to how it works technologically, but the idea being that if a minicab has come in, the technology, the platform tries to match a passenger, tries to match the driver with a passenger who's looking to go the other way, so that the journey into the airport is then matched with the journey out, and you're therefore minimising empty vehicle trips around the airport. It's not one that sits with us directly, but we try and use our influence to work with minicab taxi providers to deliver this. But I think there's still a long way to go to make that a truly efficient service.
Well, I was going to ask, so presumably that sounds like something that's effectively Uber or whoever are implementing within their own platform. So that's not something that's happening now. Is it a near-term thing, a distant pipe dream?
I think it's probably a mid-term thing to make this more, even more commonplace. Again, it's not something that I'm truly close to, because a lot of the technology wouldn't sit with us, it would sit with the other providers. But it's an aspiration, and it's a topic we do discuss with minicab providers.
Okay, interesting.
I think it's a very good point.
Apparently not quite.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because it must be in their interest to get a fare on the way back, because nobody wants an asset that's not in use. It's the same with cargo. You know, you want your truck to be full and on the road the whole time. So it might be an interesting to find out a bit more from Uber and others as to why this is technically so difficult, because clearly they're very adept at technology and data, and yet this seems to slightly elude them.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Just to say, I think Uber are already doing it. But not as much as we would like, I think.
Understood. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Over to Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, and good morning to all of you. I wanted to maybe start with Anthony, and you were talking about schemes, surface schemes that were on the ground, on the table, subject to funding. And so my question is about the southern and western rail links around Heathrow, and what conversations there have been, and I would appreciate just some clarity whether or not this is kind of focusing around the same scheme that the planning inspector said in 2016 there was no funding for at the time, whether those things are linked, the southern and western. But just, where we are with building those links, because obviously that's a huge bonus in terms of moving people around from outside of London as well.
Yes, I think the Western Rail link, which would bring a spur off the Great Western Main Line into the terminals, is, I think it's relatively well. I mean, you've got a representative from Network Rail here this afternoon who will be able to say a bit more, but I think it got fairly well advanced, and then the lack of funding meant that it's been put on the shelf essentially. What's interesting is that the box at Terminal 5 is there. I mean, there's a quite extraordinary sort of hole in the wall at Terminal 5 in the underground where you go through this door, and there's this huge cavernous box ready to go, and provision was made for the future of extending those services, which is great, and we credit to those people that put that in place. So I think the Western Rail access is relatively well developed. The Southern Rail access, there's a very well worked up scheme with public sector private backers looking to do two things: to potentially extend the Elizabeth line round to Staines, which would be an absolute game changer, then also potentially linking Terminal 5 to the South Western Rail network, so providing a huge range of travel options which go way beyond the airport. And I think there's something that's really worth remarking in respect to both those schemes. They would have a massive benefit across the whole southeast and southwestern region, and so you can't just think of it in terms of getting to and from the airport. It will increase people's travel options from the southwest and from the south absolutely exponentially. So we've got schemes. They are in different stages of planning. We are waiting for the funding. We're waiting for what might happen with the future expansion of the airport or not. But I think the current rate of passenger growth argues very strongly for thinking about these schemes going now, because even if we all rushed out today and started digging, it would be about 7 years before anything actually ran. So it's a real issue.
Thank you for that. I'm just thinking out loud. So it seems like, as you said, there's a scheme in place, a proposed scheme outlined, that was subject, and Network Rail had kind of costed that up, and you said that there are private backers. Is it still the case that who's funding this, I suppose? And yeah, because it's my understanding that was kind of dependent on a third runway, but given that you're the airport operator, it seems like the two things, it would make sense to separate those two things out, to have kind of investment in the infrastructure, which should be used anyway, and then if you were successful with an application, it just seems a shame to hold up everything for goodness knows how long, and possibly never.
So the two schemes are separate at the moment. Western Rail is promoted mainly by Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce, who are the main promoters of that scheme. So when Anthony talked about backers, I think he meant promoters rather than funders, because we haven't got funders for those schemes, and government have made it clear that there is no government money for either of those schemes. The Southern Rail scheme, which we have worked together with Anthony and the Heathrow Area Transport Forum and local authorities to try and build consensus around one scheme, which we are close to doing, but we're not 100% there yet. But the majority of parties are behind the Heathrow Southern Rail scheme. That's promoted by a company called Heathrow Southern Rail. So they're both in slightly different situations. So Western, as we've discussed, had a design done, was almost ready to go to development consent order, but was kind of put on ice. And prior to that happening, government would have funded some of it, but that situation has now changed. And Heathrow Southern Rail has not reached that detailed design phase yet, so that would need to go through a bit more development to sort of catch up with the Western scheme.
Okay, so you've got consensus around the Western one, HSRS scheme.
So there's the Western Rail scheme is more developed. So I think if we were going to do a Western Rail scheme, it would make sense to do the one that's been designed. You know, we'd need to do a whole load of work around recosting that and updating all the information.
Okay.
So that's one thing. And then the Southern Rail scheme is the one that, prior to us doing this work on consensus, there have been a few different options sort of floating around, and what we've managed to get to is one that most people now agree on. If we were going to do it, this would be the best way to do it.
Okay, and what what financial commitment is Heathrow considering? Are you considering doing that directly, working with a consortium of potential investors to make that happen?
So we support both the schemes. We need to do our work on expanding Heathrow and to understand what we need to achieve in terms of mode share. We have a constraint which is around the CAA's surface access policy. So currently, if we wanted to fund a whole scheme, we probably couldn't, because a lot of the benefits of both those schemes relate to, in part, benefits to airport passengers and also benefits to other people and wider economic benefits. And under the current arrangements, Heathrow couldn't fund the second pot.
But you could fund a part of it?
If everyone was happy that there was a business case and a need, etc., we would go through our capital process. But that the amount that we could fund would be limited under the current arrangements to that which covers benefits to airport passengers.
Okay, thank you. And so to you, Anthony, is there anything about, or are there any elements of the Southern and Western Rail Link schemes that you see that you'd want to follow up with the Secretary of State for Transport or kind of any other ministers, DFT?
I think only to continually make the case for them, both in terms of access to the airport and in terms of regional connectivity. I think both schemes are very strong. They both have very good business cases. They are buildable, they are doable, and there's a clear need. So I think clearly in order to get them funded, the public sector would probably have to make some commitment about how fares are allocated in future to make sure there's a kind of income stream to support some of these things. So I don't think the money's going to come completely from the private sector, so to speak. It's complex, but in terms of making Heathrow a fully developed kind of hub, not only for airport passengers, but more broadly in terms of the potential of the surrounding area, these two schemes are very, very strong schemes and have very positive business cases. So just continuing to bang the drum.
Okay. And my final question, I just wondered, what is the actual figure, kind of the notional figure, the cost for both the Southern and the Western schemes?
Yeah, we would probably have to come back to you in writing about that. The Western costing hasn't been done since 2018-19, so it's wouldn't be up to date.
Okay, but in 2018-19, it's just to get an idea. I don't have a sense of how much this is costing.
So these schemes cost low billions to do.
So can you provide at least what was worked up in 2018-19, and then we could see that kind of maybe hypothecate that to what that might be now?
So we can work with Network Rail to provide you something in writing.
Thank you. We may ask that of Network Rail later. No spoilers, Network Rail. We might do.
My question was already asked. That was my additional question.
It's a $64 million question. That's not a figure. That's not an official figure. Assembly Member Mahfouz.
So clearly there's been a lot of conversations about Heathrow expansion and how that aligns with our objective as a nation to achieve net zero. So is there a conceivable route to achieving Heathrow's stated goal of net zero surface access without the airport investing in the new rail links that we've talked about?
So we need to do the work which we are doing currently. The government has set the timeline of the summer for our for proposals to come forward around expansion, and we've already started doing the work around the impact on transport and road networks and etc. around the airport. So we're not in a position to sort of state what we do or don't need to be able to achieve the targets that we believe we will need to meet Currently, that's 55 in the current ANPS. That's 55% public transport mode share. I think we can assume that's not going to go down, and that was the objective that Gatwick's been set in their application. So our working assumption, I suppose, at the moment is that we would need to achieve that. So we are working through kind of what our current baseline is and what we would need, what mitigations we would need in place to be able to achieve that, which would be the route to achieving net zero.
So, but in your previous answers, you talked about quite a detailed business case that were put forward indeed for both those sets of proposals. Presumably, as part of that, you had numbers of projected customers on those two routes and what that would look like, both in terms of growth for the airport, but also in terms of modal shift. Would you be able to elaborate on what that might look like?
So when the modelling was last carried out, when the previous expansion proposal was on the table, that was 2018, 2019, when that work was being done, and a lot has changed in the background since those, particularly in regards to the transport network around London since then. So it wouldn't be right to lean on what work was done back in 2018. As Sophie said, we're in the process, as part of the proposals for the summer, of starting to refresh that modelling suite and do the work. But obviously since 2019, ULEZ is now in place, Elizabeth Line is now through running. We've introduced terminal drop-off charge. There's a whole load of externalities that mean it wouldn't be right to lean on work that was done then. But we do need to understand that work, and that's why we've kicked it off.
Although apparently Elizabeth Line's offered 0% on that. So, but okay, Anthony.
I think even if you assume that the current rate of electrification of vehicles continues, I think if you just look at the traffic figures for the M25 and the M4, it's very hard to imagine a quantum leap in passenger numbers without there being some sort of really big alternative, because I think the current figures are about a quarter of the traffic on the motorway network, let alone the local road network, is airport related of various sorts. And there's not, best will in the world, there's not going to be a massive expansion in road capacity in and around that area. It's pretty crowded already. So I think you are talking about a step change of some sort.
And sorry, I think it was Sophie you mentioned earlier about, and clearly there's going to be a split in terms of the costs between Heathrow contributions and private contributions, and clearly the public sector would have to contribute something towards this. But you talked about there being other beneficiaries to extending these lines to Heathrow beyond the customers of Heathrow. I'm not sure who would be travelling to Heathrow on these extended lines other than people who either work there or are travelling from there. So who would be these other beneficiaries?
So with reference particularly to the Southern Rail scheme, it would create links for passengers not travelling to the airport. So that would be a benefit, as Anthony was saying, for the southeast of England. But it would create new journeys that people could do in that vicinity that doesn't entail going to the airport.
That's because the wider plans include wider expansions and extensions and so on.
There's a whole host of sort of wider economic benefits that would come from the schemes that we'd be working through. But obviously, the Southern Rail, or both Western Rail and Southern Rail, would both provide resilience to London's transport network as well, in terms of providing an alternative route through into London. So that there's a whole array of alternative benefits that that can be attributed to non-airport related users.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm conscious of time, so it'd be just really good to see some more, get more of that business plan details as to what that modal shift looked like. I appreciate this is pre-COVID and what have you, but it'd be really good to see more of that. Thank you.
Thanks. Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. I want to stay with this same topic, but look about what it would mean if a third runway was built. Last time the third runway was floated in 2016, Heathrow Airport committed to ensure that the number of airport-related vehicles on the road would not increase if a third runway was built. Is that likely to be the same promise again this time round?
I think it was a pledge, and it's an objective that we would continue to strive to achieve.
Okay, but obviously a third runway would result in increased passenger numbers. And so we've talked a little about the Western Link and the Southern access rail links. TfL, I know, are concerned around the Elizabeth line and the Piccadilly line capacity as well. I mean, is it Heathrow's view that those would need to be in place to accommodate the increased number of passengers and to meet your targets for non-road traffic?
So I'm going to say the same thing again, I'm afraid, but we're working on our proposals for the summer. We need to work through what actions we will need to implement, what projects and mitigations we'll need to implement to achieve a third runway in a sustainable way. We're already talking to Transport for London. We're working through with them and National Highways kind of how we will work together on developing these plans. So, yeah, we'll work closely with TfL on working through the modelling. We're working with them to have access to their modelling suite so that when we're discussing things with them, we're all talking in the same language. And so we're starting from a baseline of at least agreeing the facts. So we work closely with them, and whether or not we need to improve capacity on Piccadilly line or Elizabeth line will be part of what we consider.
Okay, thank you. Can I turn to Anthony then? Because I note that your board's 2020 report about the Heathrow expansion position statement said that with regards to the Southern and Western Rail and the full Piccadilly line upgrades, not the current upgrade that's taking place with regards to trains, but the full, including the track and signalling, you stated that it is essential that significant expansion of the airport should only be considered alongside a clear commitment from government and Heathrow Airport Limited to provide new high-capacity rail access to the airport. Is that still your board's view, and what actions or what work are you going to be undertaking if the third runway proposal gets legs, as it seems to be doing again?
Yes, that would still be our position. In terms of action, clearly, we're not a body with power.
Yeah.
There's plenty of other people with all the power in this respect, but our job is to look at what the airport and others are proposing and to critique that and to just assess the suitability and the capability of what's being put in place. And I think all of the discussions about expansion must be predicated by discussions about how on earth people are going to get to and from the airport, including cargo, of course, which is, Heathrow is a highly successful cargo hub, and more planes probably means more cargo, and so that needs to be in the mix as well.
Thank you. And has your forum been content with the past, I suppose, proposals from Heathrow with regards to public transport upgrades and so forth, and particularly their, I'm not going to say reluctance, but concerns about how much they should fund it?
Broadly, yes. I mean, obviously, you always want more, and but we at the back of our minds there's always the recognition that Heathrow is a business. At the end of the day, it has to make money, and if it doesn't make money, none of these good things happen. And so there's all sorts of trade-offs and balances that have to be made in all this. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of the government's commitment about sustainability. Clearly, something has to change in a big scale in terms of surface access for the airport to come anywhere near meeting the government's commitments in that respect.
Thank you. And perhaps if I can just ask my final question to Heathrow, and that's obviously discussions with government have started at an early stage, but there does seem to be this tension between perhaps transport and growth and in the environmental issues with regards to it. Are you at the heart of those discussions, and how are they progressing so far?
So we're working through our proposals. Our objective is to make sure that any expansion at Heathrow would be done as sustainably as possible. So that would be our approach in those discussions, but I can't really comment further than that.
Okay, I'll leave it there then, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks. Assemblymember Curry, did you have a follow-up?
Quick. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Heathrow is not the only airport that's looking into expansion plans. Gatwick is in the market for a second runway, and that decision will be made earlier this year. So if Gatwick receives approval for its second runway, how does this impact Heathrow's plans for a third runway and the accompanying need for expansion surface access?
So I guess I would say that's kind of not within my remit. My remit is if Heathrow is going to expand, to make sure that we do it in the right way.
So I would have thought they would be within your remit, because are you suggesting that it doesn't matter what happens with Gatwick, the plans will still go ahead with Heathrow? Because obviously it will link, it will have an impact.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting it's probably not within my purview to comment on that.
Okay, right.
Is that
quite surprised by that, but
is that something that you could get a response to us on? That would be great, because it is obviously of interest to us. Obviously, we don't always understand exactly what different roles cover. Assembly Member Russell with us.
Yes, just very briefly, Sophie, you just said earlier that Heathrow expansion will be done as sustainably as possible. I'm assuming that still means that you still at least stick to the existing targets in terms of the reducing surface access carbon emissions and the kind of existing targets around surface access, levels of traffic and all the rest of it. You're not saying it'll get worse. You can at least meet those.
We're working through all of that at the moment, but as a team, our working assumption is that we at least will need to achieve the targets that are already outlined in the ANPS.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And those are all our questions for you. And thank you very much to first panel of guests. Would also like to acknowledge that thank you for coming when obviously your plans are in development, and there we're asking quite a lot of questions that you don't feel that you're able to answer. I hope that it will be the start of engagement, and we'll be able to talk in some form when your plans are in more detail. Also, just to say, obviously there were, well, not obviously, we had lots of more questions that we didn't quite ask, particularly around bus and coach, and I feel really sad we had to drop those questions. So we'd like to put those in writing to you, if that's okay. Thanks. We'll now take a short break before we resume with our second panel. So if everyone could be, well, not you, you're allowed to go. Everyone else could be back at 11:45. That would be great. Thanks very much. Welcome back to today's Transport Committee meeting and our discussion on...
Thank you, colleagues. I suspend this meeting until First Minister's questions at 12 noon. Thank you. We move to First Minister's questions, and at question number 1, I call Russell Finlay.
Thank you, President Officer. I begin by paying tribute to Christina McKelvey, a respected colleague and a dedicated public servant. And my thoughts and those of my party are with her family, her friends and colleagues. And I know that her passing this morning at the age of 57 will be difficult for many here today. And I note that you have indicated that members will, quite rightly, have an opportunity to pay full tribute to Christina in due course. I intend to ask the First Minister about an Audit Scotland report which was published today and which lays bare serious problems with GP care in Scotland. The report makes explicit multiple recommendations, including 5 that should be completed by the Scottish Government within a year. So will the First Minister guarantee that he will deliver on the report's recommendations?
First Minister.
President Officer, first of all, may I thank Russell Finlay for his kind remarks about my dear colleague Christina McKelvey and appreciate his condolences to all on this sad news. In relation to the question of the Audit Scotland report, obviously the Audit Scotland report contains some recommendations that the Government will consider. We are taking forward a series of investments to strengthen the access to healthcare within Scotland, and general practice is one of the areas where that access is at its most critical, and the Government's investment through, for example, the Primary Care Improvement Fund and other steps that have been taken to expand the workforce within general practice are part of the practical steps that we're taking to address the issues in the Audit Scotland report.
Russell Finlay.
These commitments should be delivered so that patients can get a face-to-face GP appointment when they need one. The Independent Auditor General's report states that the Government has not met previous pledges which should have been delivered by 2021. And his report calls for, and I quote, a clear delivery plan for general practice by the end of 2025 that includes specific actions, timescales and costs. So can the First Minister confirm that he will bring forward this plan by the end of the year for the benefit of patients across Scotland?
First Minister.
So, as I set out in my speech on the National Health Service in late January, there are a number of different interventions the Government is going to take to improve access to healthcare services. And right at the heart, as I said in my first answer, will be access to GP services. And the Government has set out our intention to explain the specific interventions that we will make in that respect, and that information will be shared publicly very soon. Now, of course, we start from a high platform here, in the sense that Scotland has the highest number of GPs per head of population in the United Kingdom. We are determined to build on that. We are also determined to expand the workforce within general practice. So, for example, we have employed over 3,500 whole-time equivalent staff in other primary care teams, which are designed to ensure that we boost access to healthcare. And we've also employed an additional 1,300 whole-time equivalent staff to support general practice through health boards. So these issues, which I accept are important about the manner in which we, members of the public, are able to access general practice, are being responded to by the investments that the Government is making.
Russell Finlay.
Thank you, President Officer. Another publication released today by Healthcare Improvement Scotland details serious concerns at A&E units in Greater Glasgow. These problems are consistent with what's happening at hospital emergency departments across Scotland. The regulator says that it has become routine for ambulances to queue up outside Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and for patients to be treated in corridors. And the HIS report says that patient safety is being, and I quote, seriously compromised. So does the First Minister agree that it's unacceptable, and explain what steps he will take to put patient safety first?
First Minister.
Patient safety is an absolutely fundamental prerequisite of our healthcare system, and the report from Healthcare Improvement Scotland was designed to address the legitimate concerns raised by representatives of the staff in the emergency departments of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and I expect the board to implement and address the findings of the Healthcare Improvement Scotland report. And indeed, I'm confident that the board will do so. There has been an entire change of leadership in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, with a new chair, new chief executive, new medical director in place in the board, taking forward, as the chief executive of the Health Board has made clear publicly, at pace and at scale, the reforms necessary. On the wider question, I understand the concern about access to accident and emergency services, but what I would reassure members of the public about is that we have been seeing for some weeks improvements in the performance of A&E units against the 4-hour standard, and that has been improving over a number of weeks as we recover from the significant disruption that was felt as a consequence of the flu outbreak which dominated over the Christmas New Year period and well into January. So I think we are seeing a strengthening position within A&E, and of course on the substance of Russell Finlay's question about Healthcare Improvement Scotland, I expect those recommendations to be addressed by the board.
So Finlay.
Thank you. For its report, Healthcare Improvement Scotland surveyed NHS doctors and nurses working in 3 separate hospitals, and shockingly the majority of those surveyed said that patients rarely receive care that is either appropriate or timely. And the report makes a number of suggestions to NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, but it also makes 4 national recommendations to the Scottish Government. The report advises the Government to define new standards and introduce new guidance to improve the quality and safety of patient care. And these are sensible suggestions that could improve patient experiences and reduce NHS Scotland waiting times. So will John Swinney take the necessary and decisive action to make these changes, and if so, by when?
First Minister.
These are urgent priorities for me, Presiding Officer, because they get to the heart of what I think is the key issue that is affecting the performance of our healthcare system in a number of respects, which is the ability for us to manage flow within healthcare settings. So if a hospital is at full occupancy, for example, it is difficult for staff in an emergency department to admit individuals into hospitals if the hospital is congested. Now, what we are working to ensure, and then obviously if hospitals are congested because we don't have enough social care provision within the community, then that means that we will have delayed discharges within our hospitals. So there's an integrated link between emergency departments, hospital occupancy and delayed discharge. And I assure Mr Finlay that all 3 of these elements of the flow within the healthcare system are priorities for the Health Secretary and I as we undertake weekly scrutiny of the performance of the health system and the work to reduce waiting times. And it will also be strengthened by the point that Mr Finlay made to me in his first question, which is about strengthening access to general practice, so that at the earliest possible opportunity, individuals with healthcare requirements can get the appropriate treatment and support. And of course there is a wide variety of treatments and support available through pharmacies, through general practice and through other allied health professionals to whom we wish to improve access.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, I'm so sorry at the passing of Christina McKelvey, and I know her pain will be felt most deeply in the SNP, but it will be felt across the Parliament. And my thoughts and the thoughts of the entire Scottish Labour Party are with Keith Brown, Christina's wider family, friends and all her colleagues across this Parliament. She was a dedicated local MSP, and her campaigning on women's health, particularly as she battled breast cancer herself, brought into the public eye many of the issues that are too often ignored. Yes, she was fierce politically at times, but she was also great fun. And across this chamber, and I assure you across all parties, many have lost a friend, and our deepest condolences go to all her family, friends and colleagues at this difficult time. The Chamber will know of my long-standing concerns about the leadership and culture at NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and today's Health Improvement Scotland report into emergency departments across Greater Glasgow is devastating. Corridor care normalised, frontline A&E staff's repeated concerns ignored, worse still, staff bullied and silenced, and patient care compromised, often with devastating consequences. Does John Swinney think this is acceptable?
First Minister.
First of all, President Officer, may I thank Anna Sarwar for the generous remarks that he has made, and I appreciate the words that he's expressed about our dear colleague. In relation to the Healthcare Improvement Scotland report on Greater Glasgow and Clyde, I don't think that the practice that Mr Sarwar recounts is acceptable. That's why Healthcare Improvement Scotland have responded to the concerns that have been expressed by the clinicians. In relation to I acknowledge the sustained questioning that Mr Sarwar has led on the leadership of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. As he will know, there is new leadership in place that is addressing and committed to addressing all of these questions that are raised in the report. And indeed, Professor Jan Gardner, the new Chief Executive of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, has indicated publicly the commitment she has to addressing those recommendations with pace and at scale to ensure that the issues are properly addressed.
Anna Sarwar.
I've been raising concerns for years with successive SNP health secretaries and First Ministers, but here we are again. This is just the latest report after 29 doctors raised concerns almost 2 years ago, and it exposes serious issues around the culture of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. But it follows the same pattern. Patient safety compromised, staff ignored, bullied and silenced, and when they blow the whistle, the management deny their claims, intimidate them and attempt a cover-up. Staff describe the working environment as brutal and inhumane. They talk of moral distress or being haunted by some patient experiences leading to harm, and they say it's a constant battle to keep patients and staff safe and that there is no support from management. After years of warnings and hollow claims of lessons learnt, why is this SNP government allowing this rotten and at times fatal culture to continue?
First Minister.
Well, we don't accept it is in any way to be acceptable or to be resigned to. That's why Healthcare Improvement Scotland went in and undertook the investigation that they undertook, and it's why the leadership of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde are saying today that those issues will be addressed, and they'll be addressed with pace and urgency. And let me use this platform to make it abundantly clear to every health board in the country that the culture that is referred to by Healthcare Improvement Scotland is completely and utterly unacceptable. Now, Scotland has a formidable record in general on improvements in patient safety. Indeed, our patient safety programme is very highly regarded internationally because of the work that it involves. However, the quality and strength of that patient safety programme will be undermined if there isn't a culture of acceptance of the need to tackle the behaviour that the Healthcare Improvement Scotland report highlights. So Mr Sarwar has my assurance that in my communication and that of the Health Secretary to health boards, the contents of that report are unacceptable and they must be addressed by health boards around the country.
Anna Sarwar.
The problem is that patients and staff have heard this before and the culture continues, because this report highlights the unacceptable normalisation of corridor care and patients stuck in ambulances outside A&E. 2/3 of staff surveyed felt patients rarely or never received appropriate and timely care. But for years, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital has been plagued by issues, often with deadly consequences. The most stark is the infection scandal that cost lives. And at every turn, patients, parents and staff have fought for answers but been frustrated by a rotten culture of cover-up. A public inquiry was agreed in 2019. The culture continues. The board was put into special measures. The culture continues. The first NHS board in Scotland to be investigated for corporate homicide. The culture continues. And as this latest report shows, patients are still being put at risk by a failing health board that's been empowered time and time again by this SNP government. It appears this SNP government is more interested in protecting managers and institutions rather than protecting patients and staff. So what will it take for that to change?
First Minister.
So I don't accept that characterisation of the approach of the government, because if that was the case, there would not be an inquiry into the Scottish Hospital's performance, and there would not have been a Healthcare Improvement Scotland analysis of Greater Glasgow and Clyde. So those are two examples where this government has been prepared to honestly confront real and acute difficulties within our health service, and I would expect that to be the case, and I give Mr Sarwar and Parliament the assurance that that will always be the case under my leadership. We will confront difficulties, we'll confront them openly and honestly to improve the experience of patients. Now, Mr Sarwar said that there was a normalisation of corridor care. Let me make it clear to Parliament, I don't accept that. I will not tolerate that. I will not normalise corridor care. I don't think it's a good idea to have corridor care. So what we have to do is address some of the issues I referred to in my last answer to Russell Finlay of improving the flow of patients through hospitals so we avoid corridor care. Mr Sarwar also said that patients are routinely denied appropriate and timely care. That's not. I accept there will be failings in the health service, but I don't think that is a fair characterisation of the National Health Service, because I think many people experience formidably high quality, professional, loving care from within the National Health Service, and I want to make sure that's the experience of everybody.
Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
This Parliament has lost one of our very best today. And I want to offer my deepest sympathies and those of my party to everyone who knew and loved Christina McKelvey. Today is a moment of pain and sadness, but Christina's life and her extraordinary spirit deserve to be celebrated as well. In her first speech, she said she would rather be a citizen of a nation that looks to persuade and cooperate than bully and cajole. Now, she might have been talking about Scotland as a nation, but I think those words also captured the kind of person she was and the kind of politician she was. Lots of people in politics start out with those kind of values and ideals. Christina was someone who held fast to them. Compassion and kindness were at her core. As Christina's partner and our colleague Keith Brown said today, she lit up every room she was in. And I think that was certainly true of this room, our Parliament. She brightened it in every sense. The only question I would like to ask the First Minister today is how does he think we can all bring that kindness and compassion into our work as Christina did?
First Minister.
I'm very grateful to Patrick Harvey for his kind words and all that he has said about Christina McKelvey, which I entirely endorse. And I think it's at moments like this that some of the conflict that goes on in this Parliament and in politics in general and in the wider political debate is put into sharp relief by the points that Patrick Harvey puts to me today. Now, I am no shrinking violet when it comes to defending my position and promoting the position of the government. So I'm not going to say I'm perfect and everybody else is at fault, because that would just not be the way it is. But I do think there are lessons to be learnt from the magnificent generosity of spirit of Christina McKelvey, who, despite the fact that she might have defended the government's position vigorously here, from this place, or my party's position from the backbenches when she was on the backbenches, but she would also wander out of the chamber with warmth and affection. And if anyone was facing a moment of difficulty, the first person at your side would be Christina McKelvey. So perhaps we could all maybe take this moment to rebalance and recalibrate how we act and react in our politics, reminded by the astonishing example of Christina McKelvey.
Thank you. Question number 4, Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I wish to convey my profound sadness at the untimely death of our brave and much-loved Christina McKelvey, sending heartfelt condolences to Keith and her family. She was truly a force of nature. To ask the First Minister what his response is to the UK Government's 2025 Spring Statement.
First Minister.
President Officer, the Government is concerned by a number of details within the UK Government's Spring Statement, not least of which the assessment which has emerged from the Department for Work and Pensions, that the measures contained in the Spring Statement are likely to drive 250,000 more people into relative poverty including 50,000 children. Those cuts to welfare have a direct impact on Scotland's budget. The Fraser-Valander Institute has estimated that it will see a block grant adjustment to our budget that removes £455 million in 29-30.
Ms Gibson.
I thank the First Minister for that reply. Since Labour came to power, we've seen a shameful litany of broken manifesto promises, from rising household energy bills and denial of justice for WASPy women to imposing benefit cuts on disabled people and slashing public services. It's hardly surprising that long-standing Labour members have resigned, denouncing its betrayal of their own voters. Will the First Minister confirm that while Labour's Holyrood branch office meekly and embarrassingly chooses a policy of omerta in the face of UK Labour cuts, this SNP government will always stand up for the most vulnerable people in our communities?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has legislated, for example, where we've acquired new powers on social security, to implement a social security system that's based on dignity and respect, and that will always be the approach that we take. We legislated for that to ensure that was the approach that was taken in the future. So Mr Gibson has my assurance that those values will always be at the heart of the decisions that are taken by the Scottish Government. I want to make sure that we put our focus into the necessary work to eradicate child poverty. That will become more challenging as a consequence of the Spring Statement, because we are once again, as we found with the last Conservative Government, swimming against a tide of rising poverty levels as a consequence of UK Government decision-making. Our data in Scotland released today demonstrates that we are seeing reducing levels of child poverty in Scotland, but that pattern will be challenged by the prevailing decisions that have been taken by the Spring Statement.
Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I add my expression of sympathy and condolence to the family and friends of Christina McKelvey, and particularly to our colleague Keith Brown. Presiding Officer, OBR forecasts released yesterday revealed that by the end of the decade, tax receipts from North Sea oil and gas will slump from £5.4 billion to just £2.3 billion as a result of declining production. First Minister, how can this be described as a just transition?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I've been sort of listening to lots of debate over many years, including certainly during the 2014 referendum, that indicated that oil revenues were not going to be a source of strength for Scotland in the future. I think what Mr Hoy is alighting on is the challenges that exist as a consequence of a declining oil basin. We have to adjust to that. We have to put in place the measures to tackle those issues, and that's what the Government is doing.
Question number 5, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to reduce waiting times for children and adolescents for the diagnosis of autism and ADHD.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, long waits for support are unacceptable, which is why we are working closely with health boards and local authorities to ensure they are tackled. As part of this work, we have allocated £123 million to health boards this year to support improvements across a range of mental health services, including neurodevelopmental services.
Murdo Fraser.
I thank the First Minister for his response. As I am sure he is aware, last week NHS Tayside announced it would no longer accept referrals for diagnosis for autism and ADHD from children or adolescents unless they have other mental health conditions, a decision that the National Autistic Society have described as beyond comprehension. Elsewhere in Scotland, we see similar issues with long waiting times of 5 years or more, arising from a severe shortage of qualified professionals and therefore an inability for health services to meet the rising level of demand. So what action is the Scottish Government taking to address the concerns of many young people and their parents that they will not now be able to access the help they desperately need?
First Minister.
Sir, I have considerable sympathy with the points that Mr Fraser has put forward, and I'm very concerned by the manner in which the proposals that have been set out by NHS Tayside have been communicated, because I acknowledge that they are likely to have caused alarm. Indeed, I see it in my own inbox as the Member of Parliament for Perthshire North. So I accept that these proposals have not been well communicated. I think what NHS Tayside is trying to do is trying to recognise that there is early intervention support that can be available within the community that can assist young people who are presenting with mental wellbeing challenges, which, if we do that, will eventually reduce pressure on the CAMS service, so the CAMS service can be focused on those children with the more acute clinical requirement for that support. That's what is proposed. I don't think that's been particularly well communicated to members of the public. So what I give Mr Fraser the assurance about is that the Health Secretary is working very closely with NHS Tayside and with other boards to ensure that the model that I've just explained to Parliament is the one that people feel and experience, because I think it does stand it has the potential to better meet the needs of young people in Scotland. And for reassurance, can I say to Mr Fraser and to Parliament that for the first time ever, national performance against the 18-week CAMS standard has been met, with 90.6% of children and young people starting treatment within 18 weeks of referral. Now, that is progress because we have increased CAMS staffing levels by 63% in the last decade. But if we are truly to meet the challenging presentations of mental well-being that young people are experiencing today, which I think has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and by other factors in our society, we have to put in place the earlier intervention services which were somewhat missing from the NHS Tayside announcement.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a difficult day for us all, and my heartfelt condolences to our dear friend and colleague Keith Brown, MSP, and also to Christina's family. First, Sir Presiding Officer and First Minister, I have a constituent whose daughter is awaiting an ADHD assessment. She sees a counsellor once a week in school while awaiting an appointment with a neurodevelopmental service. They've said that they want to wait to see her when she is in primary 7, but even then there is still a 26-month waiting list. Now, this is unacceptable. So what support can be given to the health services in my Greenock and Inverclyde constituency to help reduce these waiting times?
First Minister.
So, as I indicated in my earlier answer to Mr Fraser, and I won't repeat all the details that I gave there, but I acknowledge the seriousness of the point that Mr McMillan puts to me on behalf of his constituent. Now, the Government's budget obviously includes substantial new investment in health boards, and in my earlier answer I indicated that we are making progress on the achievement of the CAMS performance statistics. I think that combination of early intervention, enabling us to ensure that the service can be focused on those children with the most acute needs, will help us to address the substance of the point that Mr McMillan puts to me today. And I'd be happy for the Health Secretary to address specifically the points that Mr McMillan has has raised on behalf of his constituent.
Paul Sweeney.
Presiding Officer, may I add my condolences to the family and friends of our colleague Christina McKelvey. She was a kind person and a cheerful and helpful minister who often went out of her way to assist colleagues in resolving many issues that they dealt with in their constituencies. Presiding Officer, earlier this week, families and the patients attending the Notre Dame Children's Centre in Glasgow were shocked by the announced closure of the centre, which provides invaluable treatment for children who have experienced trauma through abuse, neglect or bereavement. This is unacceptable, and it is linked directly to cuts proposed by the Integrated Joint Board in Glasgow to cut psychological trauma services by 22%. Will the First Minister please give families and patients affected the reassurance that the Government will intervene in this case and not allow such a devastating cut to mental health services to take place?
First Minister.
I'm grateful to Mr Sweeney for his kind remarks about Christina McKelvey, and he's absolutely right that she went out of her way to help members on all questions. I am concerned to hear about the news about the Notre Dame Centre, and I've asked Government officials to liaise with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Glasgow City Council, who obviously are the partners in the Integrated Joint Board, to address the concerns and to provide the reassurance that we all need that the demand on the services that would have been provided by Notre Dame are able to be met in the future, because it's vital that individuals who require these services are able to access them.
Question number 6, Mercedes Vialba.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I would also like to add my condolences to the family, friends and colleagues of Christina McKelvey at this tragic time. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to prevent instances of water scarcity in 2025.
Minister.
President Officer, climate change is driving more extreme weather conditions in Scotland, and this month the Scottish Environment Protection Agency reported that Scotland has had a drier than average winter. Scotland's National Water Scarcity Plan sets out how water resources will be managed during periods of prolonged dry weather. As part of that plan, the Scottish Government, SEPA and Scottish Water have established rigorous processes to monitor the situation and support those affected. Summer is normally a crucial time of the year for water demand and potentially for water shortage. It's important water users and abstractors are aware of the risk of water scarcity so that we can all help to reduce pressure on the water environment. From May, SEPA will provide weekly water scarcity reports to update key sectors and stakeholders on the position. And I thank Mercedes Villalba for her kind remarks about Christina McKelvey.
Mercedes Villalba.
Thank you. I thank the First Minister for that response, because any commitment from the Scottish Government for improved resilience to our water system is welcome, because upgrading our water infrastructure is going to be crucial to prevent water scarcity and also flash flooding and wildfires. But according to the outgoing Chief Executive of Scottish Water, it's only investing 40% of what's required to upgrade our water infrastructure, while at the same time we're seeing it become increasingly reliant on outsourcing services, maintenance and upgrades to private interests. So can I ask the First Minister whether he agrees that the people of Scotland deserve public services that reinvest profits in-house rather than outsourcing and privatising public goods by the back door? Does he support that principle?
First Minister.
I very much support the principle of water being owned in the public sector and managed in the interest of the public sector, which is exactly what Scottish Water does. And of course that's different from the water management systems, certainly in England, which are privatised and which are of poorer quality, less resilience and more expensive and not operating as firmly in the public interest as Scottish Water. So the model that Mercedes Villalba talks about is the model which I believe is in place in Scotland. Is obviously Scottish Water will procure external construction support to enhance water infrastructure, which I think we would all accept is necessary to ensure value for money for the public purse. But Scottish Water invested over £1 billion in 2023-24 and plans to invest a total of £6 billion across the current regulatory period between 21 to 27. And I can't overstate the importance of this, given the fact that we are experiencing. You answered a question last week about wildfires in March in Scotland. I just leave that sentence for Parliament to think about. Wildfires in Scotland in March. It should be significantly wetter than that in Scotland these days to cope with such circumstances. But that's an illustration of the challenges that we're facing. But I very much endorse the approach that's set out by Mercedes Villalba.
Question number 7, Ash Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd also like to extend the deep condolences from all at the Alba Party to the friends and family of Christina McKelvey at this very sad time. To ask the First Minister, in light of reports of an escalation of gang-related violence in Edinburgh with recent shootings in Niddrie and West Pilton, what immediate action can be taken to support the emergency services in ensuring the safety and reassurance to communities in my Edinburgh Eastern constituency?
First Minister.
So I'm grateful to Ash Regan for her comments on my dear colleague. And in relation to her question, I'm deeply concerned by recent incidents in Edinburgh and I'm fully supportive of Police Scotland's efforts to apprehend those responsible. While it would be inappropriate to comment on the investigation itself, I can reassure members that significant resources being put into the scrutiny of CCTV, door-to-door inquiries and increased patrols are being deployed in the area. And I would encourage anyone with information to report that directly to Police Scotland. There is, of course, a range of other measures that have been taken in relation to the work of the Serious and Organised Crime Task Force key partners to disrupt, deter and detect serious organised crime, and that remains an absolute priority for all partners.
Ash Regan.
the very serious concerns that were raised at the Scottish Police Federation conference over issues like officer burnout and under-resourcing leading to reactive policing must be urgently addressed to support our police, who in turn support our community safety. Edinburgh residents have the right to reassurance from visible, proactive policing and not to be left at the risk of being caught up in gang warfare. So will the First Minister commit today to review the allocation formula for police funding to Edinburgh and consider targeted support for policing in areas of rising gang activity?
Minister.
These issues are, of course, and those judgments are a matter for the Chief Constable in the exercise of her operational responsibility for control of policing, and it would be inappropriate for me to specify where police officers should specifically be located, other than to reassure communities that where there is intelligence that is actively scrutinised by Police Scotland to identify the potential for violence to emerge in our society, that will be responded to by Police Scotland and resources allocated accordingly. Now, of course, in the budget, the Government has allocated £1.62 billion to support police capacity and capability, which is an increase of £57 million in resource funding to enable our police to be able to undertake the roles that we expect them to undertake. And there is now capital funding in place which is assisting with the renewal of the estate, technology and fleet activities, and also investment in body-worn video camera equipment, which has been rolled out for the first area of the country in the last few days.
Webber.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These events should concentrate the minds of the Scottish Government regarding the ongoing under-resourcing of policing in the capital. 3 years ago, Edinburgh had 120 fewer officers than its population needed, and that by March last year there were 22 fewer than the year before. Can I press the First Minister? Will the Scottish Government commit to resourcing Edinburgh's police force in a manner that reflects the growing population and the additional complexities needed to police a capital city?
First Minister.
Well, I give that reassurance that the Chief Constable will address these issues. The Chief Constable is responsible for the operational deployment of police officers around the country. I believe the financial settlement we've put in place for policing is adequate for the challenges that we face in our country, given the fact that we know that recorded crime is down 40% since 2006-07. And there has been a 54% fall in attempted murder and serious assault. So we have, comparatively speaking, lower levels of crime in our society, but we continue to invest in policing, and I know the Chief Constable will be very attentive to the deployment of resources effectively around the country to meet the needs of communities facing challenges.
We move to constituency and general supplementaries. I call Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also offer my heartfelt condolences to Keith, to Jack and to Lewis on the sad and untimely passing of our friend and colleague, Christina McKelvey. First Minister, you mentioned the Notre Dame Centre earlier in my constituency. They have supported young people and families with complex trauma right across Glasgow since 1931, and they now face imminent closure. It follows NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and partners pooling funding despite an outstanding record, meeting all required outcomes and with no concerns having previously raised. This appalling decision has created great anxiety and uncertainty for 100 children and their families currently being supported and those on waiting lists. This is no strategic redesign of service. That would surely have involved working with Notre Dame, not blindsiding them, and the decision must be reversed. Will the First Minister urgently meet with myself and the Notre Dame Centre to hear of our deep concerns, and will the Scottish Government, as I have done, raise their concerns directly with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and partners?
First Minister.
Those concerns have been raised with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and with the City Council, but I would of course be very happy to meet with Mr Doris on these questions. I understand his long-standing connection with the Notre Dame Centre and his appreciation of their work, and I'd be happy to meet with him and with the Centre to hear the concerns that have been raised in Parliament today.
Thank you. Jackson Carlo.
Thank you. Presiding officer, I've been appalled in the last few weeks at an unprecedented series of attacks, sectarian attacks targeted on St Joseph's Primary School in Busby in my Eastwood constituency. The buildings have been sprayed with offensive and sectarian discriminatory graffiti. The outdoor play area was set on fire, and there was a further arson attack on a children's area just this last weekend. The school community have been left stupefied and naturally distressed, but I do want to pay tribute to Police Scotland and East Renfrewshire Council for the decisive way in which they have intervened